We're about to get started. Thanks for coming out tonight for the opening of No Longer Art, Salvage Art Institute. To let you know what's happening, we're going to have a bit of a conversation about the exhibition, about the Salvage Art Institute, and about Elka Krajewska's project, which has spawned this entire event. And we're going to talk to our guests, who I'll introduce to you in a few minutes. But I want to mention that this is a two-part event. There will be a continuation of the discussion on November 30th, in which we have even more speakers from even more diverse fields than we have tonight, who are going to talk about some of the mysteries of salvage art. And before we launch into the discussion, I have to begin with some acknowledgments. The most important, I think, is acknowledging the fact that the gallery has been closed for the last 16 months. And it's been closed because we've been in the process of a very lengthy renovation. And while we're still not yet completely renovated, there's so much pressure with the exhibitions we've been working on that that we felt we just had to kickstart the exhibitions program again. But I really want to thank the Arthur Ross Foundation and Mrs. Ross, who is with us here tonight, for their generous support for the renovation and their ongoing involvement in the life of the gallery. Equally importantly for this project is the participation of AXA Art Insurance Corporation. Christian Fischer from AXA. The project wouldn't have been possible without their ongoing help. And we want to thank them for their intellectual involvement, as well as their donation of works to the Salvage Art Institute. And Matthew Knight, Colin Quinnan, and Christian Fischer have all been incredibly important to us. It's, for those of you who know the gallery, you know this is a university gallery, and the only way we can do anything is with a student crew who, on top of all of their hours in studio tormenting themselves, they're donating even more of their hours here to keep the gallery going. So I want to thank the crew, and in particular the exhibitions assistants, Zoe Florence and Nicholas Reiter. Adam Bandler, who is working with me on exhibitions, is sleeps even less than I do on these projects, so he deserves recognition. And Dean Wigley for his support for the exhibitions program and for his tactical assistance in placing the gallery within the intellectual life of the school. The speakers who are with us tonight, who have agreed to talk about the exhibition and salvage art, in the middle, Christian Fischer, who is not only the president and CEO of AXA Art Insurance Corporation, but is also an incredibly articulate reader and commentator on the paradoxes of the art insurance universe. Jane Bennett, to her left, is a political theorist whose work on vital materialism has been a key reference for this project. Christian Scheidemann, art conservator, owner of Contemporary Conservation, and more or less the biggest rock star in the conservation world, is with us tonight. And finally, Elka Krajewska, artist, president, and founder of the Salvage Art Institute, and a brilliant and entertaining collaborator on this exhibition and this project, and whose enthusiasm and obsessions with salvage art have been fueling this exhibition since we began. But just a few comments on what this exhibition is. There's an uncanny resonance between the exhibition, its themes, and the recent spate of gallery damage from Hurricane Sandy. But it's important to note that this exhibition has been in process for a couple of years, and the Salvage Art Institute, conceived and developed by Elka, was well underway even before we started working on the exhibition. But the project has been inserted into the school as a kind of incubator, in the sense that Elka and I taught 2 years of advanced design studios on the problem of the Salvage Art Institute and what it meant to design a kind of anti-museum as a place in which you would house objects that didn't need protection, because they had no value. And so the correlation between architecture, security, and protection was part of what was examined in those design studios. And it's this lifting of value that's at the core of the salvage art objects and at the core of this exhibition. And the Salvage Art Institute as well is similarly devoted to this understanding how value is lifted from these objects. It's the progressively more and more real institute, let's say, even if it may have started as a quasi-fictive conceptual art project. It is now, with this exhibition, launching itself into kind of public discourse and becomes ever more real. And it is devoted to the discussion and the display and the analysis of works of art that have been accidentally damaged and declared total loss objects. And for those of you who aren't familiar with total loss, we're going to discuss that tonight, obviously. But one of its most obvious and striking oddities is that once a piece has been declared total loss, it is officially devoid of value. And in a sense, it ceased to exist within the gallery, museum, and auction system. And nonetheless, these pieces persist even as their value has been lifted from them. Elka and I have been describing these pieces as the zombies or the walking dead of the art world, right? They still survive, and yet they don't behave as we expect them to. And so the exhibition and the Salvage Art Institute are an attempt to understand these zombies and try to make sense of them. And the impulse is to also test what various regimes of value reattach themselves to these objects, even though they don't circulate within the conventional art market. So born out of accident, total loss objects are the result of a kind of magic act that reveals not only the particular histories of these objects through the actuarial assessment and description of the origins and the act of damage, but that also reveals the contingencies of their status as art objects and their contingent inscription into the art market. And just one last thought about the strange inversions that the total loss objects are described by. These are not like a whole body of work that we're familiar with in the 20th century that through the damage erupt into their art status, their status as art objects. If you think of Ed Ruscha's Royal Road Test, or Jean Tinguely's Mathematics, or even Gordon Matta Clark's Splitting, it's at the moment of damage that their artness is revealed. These are, in a sense, the inverse. It's the moment of damage in which their status as art is ended, or eradicated, or expunged. But nonetheless, even while the Salvage Art Institute and the exhibition are not interested in this sensationalizing of the damage, we're also very interested in the way these two modes of damage aesthetic operate between a whole history of 20th century damage aesthetic and the salvage art objects, which in a sense are the inverse, the other side of that entire history of visible damage. I'm sure we'll continue to discuss these features and more of salvage art tonight, but I want to pass the mic on to Elka at this point.
I assume you can hear me. Maybe. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. My biggest thanks, I think, go to Mark, because he has really, I think, lifted it from this sort of concept to some to a conversation. And that conversation that was brought here sort of exploded so many ways of which I could think about it alone. So thank you for an immense amount of work that you've put and patience to deal with me. He's a very difficult act to follow, because I can talk, but I can't speak. So, and the second biggest thanks go to Christiane Fischer, whose, I think, reception of this project. I was so surprised that she would agree to pick up this conversation. So I'm going to give you, and of course to all of you for coming, and all my friends who had patience listening to me, and all my artist friends who thought I totally lost my mind and were terrified by my website suddenly changing to this little letter. And but the way I work, I stumble upon something, and then through that confrontation, I just simply cannot let go. If something really attacks me, I have to deal with it. And so to give you a little bit of chronology of how Salvage Art Institute started, it was that kind of stumbling, a sort of confrontation with the fact, with suddenly learning that what I assumed, that when the work is destroyed, it kind of just is destroyed and it disappears physically. It somehow is meant to be destroyed or meant to be gone. But I think when I learned that actually there are these inventories in storage of work that for me as an artist would seem, non-existent, that interested me very much and moved me. And I think all the things that I felt responsibility to deal with this material. So, and this came through a casual conversation when I learned about it, but then immediately I thought I need to go to AXA Art, and I want to get a meeting, and I want to, I think my request was to be able to look at this material and in a way help to articulate what this material might be. In some way, if it's I started to call it no longer art, because for me, I needed to push it to some sort of other wall to be able to make space for actually making that conversation happen. The sort of description of dead art, or it was such petty names, like pet names for things that for me had so many different energies and powers that are provocative. So this is a little bit of the history. Basically, when I learned about it, the same day I said I wanted to start a Salvage Art Institute, because I learned that Salvage Art is the kind of official term for these works, and that I'm sure factual and then my dreaming up about this material were in sync and out of sync over those 3 years. At first I thought it's going to be a museum, and then suddenly I felt that the Institute, the way that it wants to articulate it, and because the market is so alive that it kind of, refreshes itself every day almost, like the artist studios do that too, that it's not about holding on to an inventory, but it's rather to being able to examine something that was really important to me. So I love art, and I'm an artist. This is not something about sort of positioning it into that you have to somehow sever your connection with the material through that kind of gesture. But I had to make myself a writer and a president and a founder to be able to deal with this material, to be able to find a space for myself from which I could actually look at it, because it was hard. It's a very difficult project, and frankly, for all my artist friends, it was terrible what I was doing and what this theme is all about. So this is a bit of very quickly the concept of the museum changed into an institute through actually conversation with Felicity Scott, who is, I think, the third person I would like to thank, although she's absent. She's the person who came to my studio. We were talking about a completely different project, and then when I mentioned this to her, she said, "Can I introduce it to the dean?" And that's kind of started this mechanism of finding a space for it, because I thought architecture department instead of art history department would actually be much more true to dealing with the physicality of this material. If those things really exist, they need their own space, and I have to figure out what kind of space could that be to be able to either make it public or private or accessible and non, or go through all these zones of understanding how to even look at these objects. And so this is a quick sort of history until now, where we are sitting here, and this is like really the first public event. And maybe just a little bit about the inventory and the way we're sitting here, and that the inventory is there. I think what I really wanted to have is this space. We talked with Mark and with Adam, weeks, and for 2 years in the seminars about, how do you even deal with the thing itself? Like, how do you look at it? And after reading Jane's book, Vibrant Matter, I had this feeling that there has to be this relationship between oneself and then the stuff. So you can somehow go around it, and you can separate yourself and come back to it. It has to be accessible. It's wheeled on those dollies, and it has to. Each object has its autonomous space somehow, and it's easy to turn around, and it becomes very object-like. But also, you can pull them all back into the alcove and be there and think and not be harassed by this sense of gallery space, which is also another thing. Like, how can you think that this is not an art show if it's a gallery? And there's so many conflicting things happening here. But what helps me, it's a research gallery. It's a space for the architecture. It's just so many different things that I thought, at least it puts us on the edge that this conversation can continue. And one last thing is no longer art. Obviously, this is. It was difficult for me, but also very clear that that's what the title is, and that's how I start to think about it. Because for me, as an artist, but also as somebody who has a relationship with art all my lifetime, an artwork is a synchronized mechanism of very many things. It's not just the objects. It's a lot of different things that are in coordination with each other. And when some of those elements start to fall off, it changes the thing itself. And I think when there are transformations, just physical transformation, when you have one piece and it suddenly becomes 10 pieces and it's distributed through space and it changes its form, when it changes through whatever damage, its color, its surface, all these, you can have a whole table of transformations of the work, the thing itself. But also, it's lost its audience. It's, shut off somewhere in a warehouse. It has lost possibility of conversation. It has officially lost its value. It's through so many different transactions, I feel it has lost there was a severance between the artist and the thing itself. So for some of you, like why, the artist's name is at the end of our log, it's because to reflect that removal. The art is still there, of course, but things have happened. And I think it needs to go that far to be able to create a space to actually observe, how far you can pull this away and how much space you need between yourself and the experience of art. I'm going to take too much space. So that's it. 3 things.
So we're going to continue with some comments by Christiana Fischer.
I can make my comments in 2 directions, either as a person who is aesthetically interested in art, or as somebody who has a balance sheet to manage and is in the business of insurance and deals with the monetary side of things. I think the reason why I'm here and why I talked to Elka when she first came to me, and I want to congratulate Mark and Elka for this, putting it together, and congratulations, this is fantastic, it's a dream come true. Because philosophically it's something that I have my very own opinions. Aesthetically, I'm actually drawn to works that probably look like they're dead art. I'm fascinated by a work. For example, I once saw at a conservator's studio photographs who were in a fire at a corporate collection, and the glass plexi had melted, and the photos behind it were just sort of black dust, and the frame was sort of melting, and then it was static. And I said, can I buy this? This looks just, I love it. It looks so beautiful, and it's something that looks just like it has to go to my collection. So, and then I had an experience where we displayed a work that was totally destroyed in Katrina. It was a pop art painting, and it was in the lobby of a business, and the glass in the lobby broke, and there were probably like 20 or 30 sort of holes in this painting, and there were still glass pieces sitting in it, and we paid a total loss, and then we used it and displayed it at an art fair to just show the force of hurricanes. And then somebody came up and said, "Can I buy this from you?" And I looked in person and said, "I have a collection of Katrina memorabilia." So I got this thought that one man's trash is another man's treasure. It all really depends on how you relate to and how much it is worth for you to be the owner of that object. Which brings me back to ultimately value as a market force. And it is the market that determines whether a work of art is valuable and how valuable it is. And I mean, I can tell you we're dealing with an awful lot of total losses and salvageable losses right now in the aftermath of Sandy, with thousands of works that have been affected. As an insurance company, the way we go about it is first, you know, you look at a work and then you say, what was the value for which we insured it? And then if it can be conserved, if it is deemed just a damage, we would call a conservator, and then it would depend on what is the cost of conservation and then the cost of market value, because now it's been a conserved work. And every work is different in this discussion. It depends if it's, you know, if it's more contemporary work or if it's a minimalist work or if it's an old master work. These dynamics of how much conservation is involved and how much has the work lost in value now because it is conserved is a very different discussion from work to work. So it's a very complex situation. But from an insurance company point of view, if the cost of conserving the work and then the subsequent loss in value is higher than the work was insured for, we declare the total loss because it doesn't make economic sense for us to spend money on this work. So from an insurance company point of view, this would be then considered a total loss because it doesn't make, you know, it doesn't make monetary sense to spend money on a work that will be less worth than the money that is available to pay for this conservation. But that's only one aspect. There's a lot of other points that can come into play to declare a work a total loss. There are two works out there. This is from Willem Sasnel. It's a diptych. It's one of these minimal works. We declared this a total loss, although it has been conserved. Because after we had conserved it in the discussions with the conservator, the owner, who we paid the total loss to, it was determined that the work had mold. And although it was conserved, mold can never be completely remedied. And it was said that the mold can come out again, and we do not want this work to be going back into the commercial market. So AXA, you can hang it in your offices. We then have the documentation. We will agree to the fact that we will not ever try to attempt to sell it, and it was declared a total loss for this reason. In another scenario where this would not have been brought up as an issue, and we would not have an agreement to say we will not let the work enter the market again, we very likely would have sold it. And because as from the insurance company's point of view, when we pay a loss, then we pay a total loss, we have title to the work, so we can resell the work, and very often do so, because a lot of times we pay a total loss not because the work has no more value, but because the claim situation is a complex one, and we want to accommodate our clients, so we pay a total loss, and then we deal with the aftermath of the work. I give you an example. A work by Noble Webster was in a collection, and was in an office space, and it was damaged severely by some firemen that bumped into it. And we contacted the artists, who agreed to refabricate the work. And this was probably 6 to 8 years later than its original fabrication. And we were very happy about this, because then we only had to pay the cost to refabricate the work, and we took the work, looked brand new, went back to the collector, and the collector said, I don't want this. This is not my work. This is a different thing. I don't identify with it. You know, this is my work. I bought it 8 years ago, and this is a brand new work, and I don't accept it as being the work that the artist did 8 years ago. So I could sympathize with this, with the philosophy. So we decided to pay a total loss to the collector, and we took the work, and then we went to the market and sold it. We have then, with the documentation that that was a refabricated work of a work that was originally fabricated in 2001. So we have to do that because we have to be completely transparent. So every work that we bring back to the market, we have to declare that there was conservation done, what was done. We have to provide the treatment reports, and we have to explain the situation. And in some of the documents that are provided here, you can glimpse into some of those conversations that go on our end of it. So the discussion of what is a total loss is a really complex one, and I sort of cynically always say, especially, well, let me bring in another thought. Oftentimes, artists have very strong opinions about their works. And an artist, although a conservator might be able to conserve the work, an artist might not like the fact that there's his work out there now in a conserved condition. And he says, I don't consider myself the artist of this work anymore. I want this work to be destroyed or be taken out of the market. And as you all know, under the Visual Artists' Rights Act, the artists have quite a lot of right what happens to their works. And a lot of, when I arrived at AXA, and I was interested in art before I became somewhere involved in the insurance world, and I realized that when artists ask us to destroy works, we would comply with this. And I immediately changed this practice. I said, why would we do this? Well, the artist wishes us to destroy the work. They think it's a total loss. I said, well, that's fine, and we can come to an agreement with the artist that we take it out of the commercial environment, but as an object, this work still represents part of our cultural history. And my saying was just imagine all the damaged works from the Roman times and the Greek times would have been thrown out. How empty would the Met be? And so, from a philosophical point, I think I respect the artists and I respect a lot of the market conditions, but there's value to keep the work either in a museum study collection or even giving it to conservators to do treatment tests on an original work of art is one way that this work might still have an afterlife, even if it's considered dead in a commercial sense. But I think the key point that I'd like to make is to say that an artwork can be declared a total loss or a dead work of art for one reason or another, and it might not necessarily mean that it has no value anymore, because the total loss aspect is predominantly driven by just the monetary portion of it. Yes.
Great. Thanks, Christian.
What I like about Elka's show is that it is primarily about art. It's not about damage, it's not about artworks, but it's about art that has been removed from its material, from its value. It shows how fragile it is. It shows how permanent it is, even when the value is removed, it still has a sentimental value. And as you all know, some damages enforce the value of artworks, as you have said. And the other thing I find quite striking in this show is that it shows a lot about art and the relationship to humans. Most of these artworks have been damaged in transit or have been damaged by people, yeah, by contact, by people who did not know about the material and about the value. They just treat it as a thing, and maybe we speak later a little bit about the thing, the relationship between the thing and the person. And of course, as you know, there are mechanical damages, there are indirect damages through water leaking. So we have some mechanical damages. We have water leaking. We have not here, but the famous example from AXA is the at Reinhardt painting where someone had sneezed upon. So that was a multi-million-dollar damage, but it still is a very powerful painting, but it's not perfect. And then there are some works in this collection which I find quite interesting. They are in a perfect condition, but they are taken out of its context. And there is one piece that now, it's a triptych that only consists of 2 pieces. So the third piece is missing. So the 2 existing pieces are in a perfect condition, but the third one is missing. And of course, the artist has the right to say, this is not my work anymore, and I don't want to have this anymore. And this brings me to the conflict. What we as conservators always have to deal with is the conflict between the material and the concept. And if the material and the concept do not fit together, then there is a discrepancy, and this is often a reason to either declare it a total loss or to have everybody who is involved in this case find trust to each other. There are other works in this collection that are also in a perfect condition. We looked at it yesterday, and there is not one flaw, but the trust of the collector in this work and in this whole environment is compromised. And I think that tells also a lot in Elka's show, that there has to be a confidence between the owner and the artwork. And what we as conservators pretty often do, especially in these days after the flood, is to reconfirm the owner that the work is okay, and maybe not even show them the work before the conservation, but only after the conservation, because these images of post-flood stay in your mind, and even if the work is in total perfect condition, you have this memory of, oh, it must have been in the water somewhere. So we like to tell, just as art lovers, we like to tell people that the damage is minor, but they should probably not come and see it. Only afterwards. Only afterwards. I think my favorite piece in this show is this big canvas of painted creases and folds with this cut in the right in the middle, and it just shows me that there are 2 worlds facing each other, 2 worlds coming together. One is the artwork, and then there is like the membrane, I would say, between the artwork and the outside world, meaning art handlers, is this very thin cardboard in between, which has been cut open to unveil the artwork, and unfortunately the knife was too long, and it did not only go through the cardboard, but it went also through the canvas. And then, as Mark said, many artworks actually get better with the potential damage. And I know several artists who say, wow, this looks much better, this looks interesting. And then also, I think my whole point is that total loss and total damage is a relative description, because some artworks have several lives. They are declared dead, and then they resurrect not through restoration, but just through a different context. And we all know this case of Vincent van Gogh and Gauguin. And at one point, Gauguin became so angry at Vincent's painting that he slashed he slashed the canvas, and this painting has luckily never been restored, because otherwise this story would not have been present now. So I think that, yeah, I think I want to stop now.
Excellent. Thank you.
I organized my brief remarks tonight around two quotations. And I want to talk at first about the thrill of recognition. The first quotation is from an ad for a travel agency tour of Rwanda. And the second comes from Elka Krajewska's preface to an earlier version of the No Longer Art booklet. Both quotations speak about the experience of being thrilled. Here's the first one from the tourist brochure. Wake up to a golden glow in the sky, mountains unveiling their mists, a dramatic natural setting for what is perhaps the most thrilling wildlife experience to be had in Africa. Nothing can prepare the visitor for the impact of encountering a troop of gorillas munching bamboo in their unfenced natural habitat. The sheer physical presence of an adult male silverback defies description, nor are there words to convey the thrill of recognition attached to staring deep into the liquid brown eyes of these gentle giants who share 97% of their genes with humans. The second quotation, as I said, comes from Elka. When I arrived at an art conservation studio and saw the corpse, smears and clumps of chocolate stuck to its plexibox container and irregularly broken pieces accumulating at the bottom edge, I was thrilled by its useless, demoted state, its orphan stance, its loss of ambition, and almost erotic, glaring nakedness. End quote. Now, it's easy to see, I thought, how the human-gorilla encounter could provoke a thrill of recognition in human bodies. We share genes and eyes, not opposable thumbs, evidently. But objects, too, are a kind of wildlife, it struck me, capable of doing things, too, causing thrills within human bodies, for example. So how does the thrill effect connect, and does it connect to something like the thrill of recognition? The damaged object doesn't share much of my DNA, although it probably shares some, and it doesn't have expressive brown eyes. How could it trigger the uncanny feeling of being in the presence of an aspect of oneself located in the body of another? Which I think that, at least for me, it did. Let me return to Elka's claim that the thing's comportment is that of uselessness, demotion, orphanhood, lack of ambition. Now, it turns out that I recognize this comportment of one within my own repertoire. Even when I perform as a self-directed subject of my own making, as I am doing now, I am also simultaneously living as an object, composed myself of flesh, blood, bones, drugs, plant extracts, heavy metals, electrical charges, mold spores, perhaps, and the chains of thought, moods, and ideas that accompany them. I never fully shed my naked uselessness and orphaned ambitionlessness. The demoted object is thus perhaps eerily familiar. I think, for me, the encounter with the No Longer Art exposes a whole range of dark affinities between subjects and objects, persons and what Elka referred to as the corpse of the art object. On the one hand, these objects reveal themselves to be more active and powerful than the category of inorganic or dead matter would admit, and on the other hand, human subjects are revealed to contain a powerful strand of thingness, of recalcitrant or strong-willed materiality that resists the mold of subjectivity into which we try to cram it. It's perhaps thrilling to meet the damaged object because it allows us to admit that we are all falling apart, damaged, less than fully full selves. And we all have to perform the emotional and physical labor of restoration or conservation, of covering over the paradoxes of what it means to be a subject and object. So Elka says, I was thrilled by its useless, demoted state, its orphan stance, its loss of ambition, and almost erotic, glaring nakedness. I love that line, in part because it described for me the buzz I experience when I can temporarily drop the burden of normal subjectivity, I guess which would place me in the camp of Romney's 47%. So just to sort of sum up or conclude, when you describe it in negative terms, the damaged object does lack things. It lacks utility and ambition, but described positively, I think it affirms the richness of what its body, in need of no improvement, already is. So these objects, in a way, say, you know, take me or leave me, right? They just sort of shrug. The useless corpse has no desire to become otherwise than it is, and this viewer's body was likewise allowed to be, for a moment, just sort of thrillingly content.
It's very hard to add anything or to even want to. But I just also wanted to say I'm just really thrilled to see so many people in the gallery and try to understand what that means, because it is an amazing moment in the history of the school, because the gallery reopens, but it opens in its new, more open form. So there's actually more people in this room that you don't know about. There's a sort of, there's an exhibit here which looks for us like a painting of an audience, a sort of damaged painting of an audience.
In the dark.
Watching us from the side, watching you. I was going to say that actually you are on the one hand, you are here to help us celebrate the reopening of the Arthur Ross Gallery, and again, just to thank the incredible intellectual and literal support for this renovation, which was an attempt to take this gallery, which has always been one of the great assets of a research university, and it's treated as a research gallery, but just to open it up a little bit so that it becomes a little bit more of the mainstream of school thought. And tonight, with the gallery not quite finished, so a little bit the feeling of dress rehearsal, the audience is here as if at a seminar or as if in a lecture, but also as if posed for a photograph from here, at the very image of a university. People listening carefully, thoughtfully. It's a little bit cold in here, but nobody's going to pay attention to that, because this is the university in which we care only about ideas, not about the bodies. And your bodies are very still and all lined up on display, on exhibit. It's so beautifully illustrating the point that was just made, that there you sit where normally would be sitting the architecture on display, and in fact what's on display is off to one side, being discussed as if we all know it or can see it, or as if there is such an exhibition. This could, after all, be a sort of a ruse, this exhibit. So just a few comments about this strange thing where you now sit where the things in this gallery would normally sit, as if watched by an audience of artworks that, deprived of their status as artworks, now get to sort of observe you trying to deal with the dilemma that they pose. Since obviously one of the astonishing thing about these objects, which have been declared to be a total loss, something that one normally says only of one's children, as revenge for them declaring to you in their adolescence that you are the total loss. But the very expression total loss, which is so extreme that it cannot be true, just the use of the word total, not extreme loss or unmanageable loss, but total loss, as one says of one's children or best friends, total, you're a total loss. There is even, for example, the expression the loser, which you reserve for a friend that's no longer a friend, or a friend whose proximity to you is no longer acceptable. What is it that they have lost such that you now want to indicate that you want to have nothing to do with them? Well, in this case, the losers patrol this space, watching you, as it were, side on. So a couple of small observations about this wonderful project, which is, on the one hand, a very specific, it is an artwork itself, the construction of an institute. It's also a research project. And there you sort of sit at each end of the table, kind of controlling the art research dimension, and we become sandwiched in this. But I think one of the sort of spectacularly interesting things about this project is how quickly it cuts to the kind of, to the jugular of, it reaches the acupuncture point, to say it more politely. So many times there was laughter during the previous presentations. When you said that the knife was too long, even before people could visualize what you meant by that, there was the beginning of laughter, and then when you said, and it cut through the painting itself, then the laughter went. And so from a sort of Freudian perspective, there is nothing funny that doesn't go directly to our deepest fears and anxiety. So I think the fact that the works of total loss leave us so vulnerable that we would laugh in the face of damage, for example, in order to defend ourselves, indicates what are the stakes here. So total loss cannot be true. There cannot be such a thing as total loss, and I understand that the exact definition, total loss, really means that the expense of conservation exceeds the amount of value you would recover, which is such an interesting definition because, of course, the value of an artist's work could change over time, and therefore the judgment as to whether something's a total loss could change. So I again want to sort of celebrate the intelligence with which AXA is actually thinking this through, and even the idea of not destroying the work allows for a recalculation, and one could imagine that over time works that have been considered total loss would actually move into the sort of, as it were, profit column. I love the thought that
sure, no one's thought of that yet.
I would love the thought that other works would go back, would sort of fall back, that actually it turns out that retroactively their cost of conservation was really not worth it, and they would be, and some obscure clause in the insurance policy of AXA means those works actually come back to AXA, to the enormous frustration of the owner who doesn't realize that the calculation has changed. So this sort of floating definition of what constitutes a total loss, and I know this is a somewhat naive comparison, but I think it's worth pursuing a little bit. There is some kind of relationship between the concept of total loss and the equally tricky concept of the total work of art. That is to say, there was a moment in time in which it was thought that not only would the artwork be total in the sense that it would be every aspect of one's experience would be engaged in the concept of art. So the room, the clothes, the music, the smell, the light, everything, the total work of art as a kind of complete statement operating on, firing on every aspect of the sensory environment in a coordinated way. But it was also total art in its ambition to totality, to get to whether with one medium or another, fully engaging with you. So I think there is a relationship between the sort of unbelievable fantasy of the fullness of a work of art as captured by the expression total work of art, and the equally sort of fragile fantasy that a work has totally lost its value. And so somewhere in, and this is not exactly a simple axis, but somewhere along, or somewhere in between the fantasy of total loss and the fantasy of the total work of art, there is this extraordinary space of fragility that you described. And I think the interesting mission that you have set is to maintain the zero value of the art. So then in which way can you stage contact with this work that doesn't increase its value? Now, at first that seems impossible because total loss of work, total loss means it has no value, therefore anything you do with the object that has any kind of effect on the value of the object has ruined its zero value effect. So basically you're just endlessly tormented by the possibility that how you would transact with this object would give it the value that it doesn't have and that you are honoring. So there'd be all sorts of extraordinarily delicate procedures by which you would undo everything that you would do. You would sort of look at the work but not exactly look at the work. You would keep it but not necessarily keep it, catalogue it but not, I mean, you do all these sorts of things. But if total loss is actually somewhere in the zone of conservation, the mission is much more manageable, because then you have to have some kind of contact with the artwork that doesn't create a theory of its conservation to the point at which it would recover its values. In other words, the real danger would not simply be value per se, but having, as it were, moved the object into a space of conservation in which it would then, as it were, re-engage with value. And having said all of those things, none of that sounds that different from the maneuver by which the object was given value in the first place. So again, I think what I find so wonderful about this project, and why I love the fact that it's here as the sort of, as the reopening gesture of this gallery, is that it's a kind of reverse engineering of how it is that we in the first place credit objects with value. Even before one would get to discuss art, it comes up already in the very word object and the very sense of agreement about what constitutes an object. And I have a couple of like absolutely sort of fortune cookie-like thoughts. In fact, only one of them that worth sharing, but the formula would be something like, where would art be without loss? And I think there are like 10 different answers, all of which would be nowhere at all. In other words, the economy of the art object, and I mean literally the economy, but also the wider ecology within which art is produced, valued, protected, undersealed, and so on, depends much more on a discourse of loss. Loss is in a way the engine of this process than any kind of fullness. Like, it's not that the art object begins with the fullness of an idea in an artist's mind, which is fully invested in an object, which is that value can then be recovered by a spectator, or especially by a critic who can help the spectator, etc., etc. This model of art coming from fullness to fullness, like the fullness in the mind of the artist becoming the fullness in the mind of the spectator. This is like the sort of theory of art that has the least currency possible for a very, very long time. The opposite theory, the theory that art is in every way organized by the difficulties posed by loss, gets you much, much further. It's also inadequate. So in this sense, my final observation is simply that, of course, the insurance company is not the end game of the economy of art objects. It's not like how you deal with a breakdown in the system. It's actually the kind of engine of the entire operation, because fullness, if it is anything, is just that which can be lost. It's just like the word before loss. It is actually that which has been lost. It is always that which has been lost. So I really I'm keeping telling myself to shut up, but I have the feeling like if I say one more sentence, I'll get it right. So I try one more time. A lot of what we know of as art can be understood as a kind of framing of the question of loss, such that we would credit an object with a fullness that can never be guaranteed, never be felt, never can be what it is supposed to be. And it is the fact that the fullness, that which is always lost, is never what it is supposed to be, that renders everything a kind of nostalgia for that which has never been. And that drives the whole thing, the fragility, the beauty, the transactions, and so on. So I see you guys not like working on the loopholes of the ecology of the world of art, but absolutely working on the starting point. And architecture is in this zone from the beginning, because of all of the arts asked on to replace the sense of loss with not with fullness, but a representation of what fullness should be. It is architecture. And this begins with the tombstone, which stands exactly in the place of the deepest loss, the most unimaginable thing that there's nothing you can do to rationalize, deal with, approach, think about the loss of the one you love. So a solid object, even an object carrying the name of what you have lost, stands in the place of your greatest uncertainty and your greatest doubt. So actually objects which represent fullness in fact stand for doubt and in the place of doubt. And buildings, architecture, cities are massive collections of statements of certainty and fullness in the place of the deepest and greatest loss. So again, the whole, I'm now repeat myself, the whole economy of an object with an inner beauty and an inner strength and an inner force, this thought or desire we have for an object to carry this is premised on a deep and unending sense of unfathomable loss. So again, I just feel like you guys have just flipped the coin around and you scratch the surface of this in the most beautiful way.
Just to echo it slightly, well, recently I had a conversation with a friend. We tried to figure out when is art good? Like when do you know that something is good? And there's so many ways of thinking about it. But from the experience of working in the studio, there is this sense of extreme confrontation with something. And that confrontation requires you to displace yourself and displace the material. There are traces of that you can recognize, and these traces are very brutal. Even if something is shiny and smooth, but there's something about that embedded loss in the making of art, I think the core of it. That's why I want to echo, because I think it's already there. Mm-hmm. And then it somehow echoes then over, many different, yes?
What if you substitute the word longing for loss?
I'll let Jane answer.
Well, I wasn't all that convinced by the loss thesis, but I hesitate to speak because I think pretty much everyone in this room knows a lot more about art than I do. But yes, loss and longing, but for me also what goes on is a recovery of the positivity of a shared materiality between things and people, or so-called inanimate bodies of the tombstone and the so-called animate body of the flesh. So for me, yes, loss, but I think that's one. I see a lot of power in that account. But I think that there's a kind of positivity of the self that's usually not recognized that also gets brought to the fore, the sort of thingness of the self. Mm-hmm. And that's not exactly a loss. Mm-hmm. That was my thought.
Mm-hmm. I think what is important, salvage, the term alone, comes from the insurance company. That's where it all starts. I would explain that the term total loss is also comes from the insurance world, because that's when we just say this is a total loss because it has lost its monetary value to that point. But it starts all by the fact that we give it a value, and the object gives these days a value by the art market. Everything is driven by the art market. And so it's also the art market to a very large extent who drives the loss in value, because every gallery who now has damaged works and thinks they cannot sell them anymore because everybody wants perfect works, that constitutes in the eye of the dealer a total loss. The collector who bought a work for 1.5 million and now it's damaged and he thinks, God, I can only sell this now for 900,000 because nobody wants to buy a damaged or conserved work, that's what drives the loss. So in a way, a lot of our discussions that we have, after the conservation is done, and then now Christian said it before, from an aesthetic point of view, the work looks the same, or the work looks great. You will not even see the damage unless you look at it under the black light. And then from a pure aesthetic point of view, or from a historic point of view, the work is perfect. But it's the perception of what the market just did to this work that drives a lot of this dialogue, and definitely for us. And then you have old masterworks that people today, and they have been restored 100 times and have been damaged, and people will pay today many more, or much more for these works than they were insured for 20 years ago. But it's, for example, minimalist painting, or the more contemporary work where the art market is less forgiving, or let alone a Warhol canvas is damaged. That's a huge loss in value because they need to be pristine. It's also this whole, I think there's also a lot, and we have talked a lot about it, in today's world, everybody is obsessed with perfection. We all, we're not allowed to age, we're not allowed to have any changes, we want to look always like 16. And but that's a cultural thing that drives it. I know that, for example, in Germany or in Europe, people are much more forgiving to damages on artworks. And when you go, sometimes in a show, you go into a Picasso show. I did this exercise with some of my colleagues. I can tell you which loans come from Europe and which loans come from the US, because those European loans all have a little yellow, and they look a little bit like they smoked in the room, and they never cleaned the surface. And all the works from the US, they're all more conserved, because there's a higher obsession in this culture than there's in other cultures of what we accept and what's tolerated. And we always also know from my colleagues in Europe that loss in value payments on damaged artworks are always much lower when you discuss it with a European collector than when you discuss it, and they probably have the same experience, and when you discuss it with a collector here. So there's a lot of things that influence this loss, other than the actual damage that happened to the work.
We're going to open up to questions from some of you in just 1 second, because I want to return to the smoky atmosphere of the European parlor in which we discover these paintings, because the last time Christiane spoke to us, she also told us how certain forms of damage attach themselves to the narrative of the work of art. And so rather than being it a narrative of the fullness of the artist somehow embodied in the work, or the signature of the artist, it becomes a different sort of narrative. It becomes a narrative of what happened to this piece. And there's something really incredible about the way the status of the object shifts, not because it has been deformed through damage, but because it enters some other kind of narrative, some other mode of description. And that's part of what we're trying to pay attention to here as well, is the way these objects get dislodged from conventions of description and conventions of narration, conventions of history through this accident, right? It's not just that it lifts value, it lifts it and places it somewhere else. And we're trying to come to terms with what that other place is. But I also wanted to pick up on what Christiane was saying about the sneeze, which is a bit like the smoke. It's a kind of atmosphere that approaches the painting. And to point out that also part of what's fascinating about these works is the way that they migrate. They exist in a kind of increasingly perilous migratory state. And this is part of the pressures of the market as well. These things are moving from biennales to biennales, from moving trucks to galleries and back again. And being in constant movement exposes them to the long knives and the sneezing. And there's something about the damage that doesn't just reveal loss of value or loss of the thing, but also informs us a little bit about what circuits these objects belong to now. And I'm also fascinated by that, how the damage connects, not just to different narratives, but to different forms of evaluation, to different systems of value, but to also different stories through which we would not conventionally confront these objects. But maybe we'll see if there are any questions from people in the audience before we move on to a drink.
What to say? Who sneezed?
Yeah, exactly. Depends who sneezes.
Yeah, it depends on the value of that mucus, yes. Yes.
As an artist who doesn't make objects and thinks of art as possible.
Hold on, let me try to get you a mic. This one might actually reach you.
Thank you. Yes.
As an artist who doesn't make objects, but who thinks of art as process, I'm very interested in this discussion. And the artwork that's been in my mind all this time is Duchamp's large glass, which I do not think of as an object, but as a process. And so I just sort of wonder if anyone could comment on that. Thinking of art as a process and as a conversation, essentially, and not as objects. Obviously, there's this whole world of objects that have monetary value, but thinking of art this way, what happens to these objects in the alcove?
Well, the only thing I can think of is that Duchamp's large glass was a matter of several months, if not years, in the making, and alone collecting dust within the two, like in between these two layers, took him several months. He put one of the glasses underneath his bed and then collected dust. And then at the end, after the glass was then shattered in Brooklyn, he actually thought it was more beautiful than before. So, as I said before.
Not
what?
Beautiful, but it was completed.
It was completed, yeah.
It was completed.
And so that's what brings us back to the concept and the material. If the concept, some artists are flexible with their concept and they invite change and transition, and others, like Jeff Koons, for instance, he does not even think of aging. His work has to be pristine, and it's only the problem of the conservator to reach this.
I was just thinking that what Mark said about the sort of biography or the circulation of these objects become more overt, and that if you think about art as a process, what does a process have? It has a rhythm, it has a speed, a tempo of change, and that these things seem to bring those points about process to the fore in a way that you might not notice them in other objects. So I think that process is being demonstrated here through the wear and tear, through the circuits of circulation, and yeah.
Alan.
Yep.
To follow up on this question of the object and the process, and also with the mention of the kind of the peak art, where the arms are missing or the nose is knocked off, whatever, is all, you know, kind of happen in different points in history and kind of add to the story of the object, and also the kind of more lax your attitude toward a change in the artwork over time. In the history of conservation, was there an effect on the way that object art is conserved and perceived when there began to be art forms that were time-based or event-based or process-based, where in order to kind of like to finish the art piece, the process was to be gone through and then ended, or else or else left open in some way. Was the kind of consciousness? Was there an effect on the way that object art was imagined as being being fixed in certain ways that was affected by non-object art.
Well, I think it's a matter of documentation. There's a lot of amazing art, not artwork, that does not exist anymore in material, but it exists in transcriptions and in stories and in images, in photographs, and there is no evaluation on what is more important. And I think many conservators also in this room spend most of their time in documenting rather than preserving material.
I can. This is also reflected in installation art, and I think I remember when you spoke in Warsaw at the Contemporary Museum about this recreation of installation of Władysław Borowski, and I don't know if you remember, but you talked about when you want to recreate something or you want to repair it and bring it to its condition that you thought it was, the closer you want to bring it, the further it is. It's almost like if you want to recreate something that is materially not present, that distance, it's very hard to measure. Maybe, I mean, I don't want to interpret it, but there was that really was a striking observation. And we saw it demonstrated in the recreation of the installation of Borowski at the museum, where I felt like I'm in some dead zone. And the only thing that was vibrant were the documentary photographs from the first installation. And it was so shocking to me that the objects were there, they were placed in the kind of similar positions, but there was nothing there in a strange way.
Just, I mean, in this point about documentation, I think from the in architectural conservation, documentation is considered preservation. So you can preserve an object very thoroughly by documenting it in a way that's never been documented before. In fact, a perfectly preserved object without a parallel documentation is not considered to be preserved. So I think there's that interesting decision whether to work on the object or to work on, as it were, the documentation of the object, which would suggest that conservation itself is a time-based art form. And I think one of the interesting things about this project is a little bit of a confusion about potential confusion about where the expertise lies. For example, isn't it possible to consider that every artist works as a kind of insurance expert on their own work, making a series of decisions about what constitutes a total loss? I do the first version of a painting. I could decide to keep working on it, or whip out a new canvas. And so I think it's even in the most sort of traditional understanding of the figure of the artist, there's some kind of calculation going on about value. That value may not be strictly correlated to what will be market value, but there is a sense of insurance, about a memory, about archiving, and we certainly know that some artists decide to keep a kind of archive of the rejected works, which becomes somewhat like zombies within the work of an artist. They often don't receive a signature as a sign of the fact that they're not allowed to enter into the economy, but they could not be destroyed without in some ways destroying something essential to the work. So I think also with Mark's point, that, and again speaking very crudely, there couldn't be an art market per se without the mobility of art. So putting those two thoughts together, the ability to have a market for art, it requires the exposure of the art to a wide range of possible forms of damage. So damage is therefore not an accident that occurs to an object inside an art market, but is an almost inevitable
structural condition
occurrence, and then it's a question of degree. So again, there are countless narratives about the production of art objects. Can you come up with a single one that doesn't involve at some point damage? And if so, if so, this discourse about damage is internal to the production and reception of an art object, not simply a question of the evaluating the consequences of an action.
Just to give two extremes, you all know the shark, Damien Hirst's shark. We certainly documented very carefully when he decided to redo his artwork because the shark was deteriorating. The condition of the shark was deteriorating. There was a big article in the New York Times where he described exactly what he did, and when he was finished he said, and that's the same piece. And it's a conceptual work, and we kept this article because should there ever be, you know, a real damage to this, we would just go out, find a shark, and we created the artwork, and then say the artist said this is okay to do, and this would be much cheaper, depending, you know, how difficult it is to find a shark, than paying what the current collector paid for the work. On the other extreme, Dan Flavin, where the certificate is lost, is considered a total loss, although the beautiful artwork is still hanging there. There's no physical damage to the actual work, but we all know that, you know, such a work without the certificate cannot be sold in the market because you need the certificate to demonstrate this is the actual work. Just two very different extreme of what can prevent a total loss, although the work is completely destroyed, versus what is becoming a total loss, although there is not any physical damage to the actual artwork.
We're this far away from a drink, but I just want to finish with another phrase that we learned from Christiane last time she spoke to us and the students, which is inherent vice, which applies to those objects that have their degradation within their own materiality. And
chocolate art.
Chocolate art?
Chocolate art.
Yes, chocolate art, or Eva Hesse, for example, in the fiberglass. And so they have a certain exempt status. They can't be insured in the same way because it's understood that maybe not like the metamatic that's going to explode, it's slowly going to erode. Its entropy is its most visible quality. And so it can't be insured against that, that process. But just to respond to Alan's question about the various ways in which these instabilities occupy the 20th century imaginary of objects and where we place the stabilizing force of insurance and this discussion has to be understood in relationship to all of these destabilizing forces, I think. Before Elka has the last word, as soon as she does, we're going to go have a drink, a different kind of inherent vice, and I just want to say that this is just the beginning of a conversation that we are going to continue on the 30th with more people. So, you know, if you become addicted to this puzzle, please come back then.
So I want to go back to Alan's question, address it briefly, and all the elements that we spoke about and of being in this space. If people that know me know that this book has accompanied my project from the beginning. It's William Carlos Williams Patterson. When the water has receded, most things have lost their form. They lean in the direction the current went. And I just read it today again. And very recently, I read a text by Karl Mancuso Ungaro, who's a conservation scholar for the Whitney and Harvard. And a catalog for J. DeFeo show that's now in San Francisco and it's coming to the Whitney Museum. She speaks about the artwork of J. DeFeo, The Rose, which is one of the most problematic paintings in existence probably, as being supine in the storage room. And through that position, it's almost just sheer materiality, sheer material. And only now, I'm putting all these things together when I look at how we place this inventory as this kind of leaning position, as a position of transformation of some sort, as a position of instability. It's subconscious, I think, but when I read this leaning and when I think about how Carol then describes the work going upwards again and regaining almost its strength as an artwork, I'm lucky, I mean, I'm happy we're so lucky to kind of sense it and bring that wheeling, you know, physical presence of those works in that particular form.
Thank you all.
Especially refrigerated. Right.